uh, how I actually use Lando, and there is much more to it. It's a big development environment. You can do a lot of stuff with it. But I heard a lot about it. There you go. Bree says love Lando. Heard a lot about it. Few people used it here and there. So obviously, it was something I would look at one point. And once we got a junior developer, I thought it's a good idea because we had a few setups using either local setup or Docker setup. I thought, well, I'll look at some tools for Drupal that's everyone's talking about, and there was a choice between Drupal VM, Lando. So I decided to give Lando a go, and it wasn't quite clear straight away what to do because I already had Drupal environment, the Drupal repository. So I thought, okay, I need to find a way. I already have a repository. What to do? Because I went to a Lando website, and it says, okay, you have these recipes, and you can connect it to a Pantheon. You can connect it to a platform Sage for those who don't know they managed Drupal hostings, or you can connect it to a GitHub repo. And I was like, so what do I do? So I install Lando. It's a brew. If you're running Mac, it's a brew install. It requires Docker as a dependency, but it's basically a layer above Docker that gives you some recipes. And it's not just Drupal, it's not just PHP. There are different recipes, and we'll go through the website, have a look at a couple of recipes, but I'll just gonna tell you the story. Basically, this presentation is about you have a Drupal environment and you want to quickly convert it to something that quite a few people can use. So the command is, once you install Lando, the command is lando init, and it will ask you a few questions. So if you go to the help on a website, it will ask you questions. What's your source? Is that Pantheon? Is that platform SH? Maybe it's a GitHub or GitLab repository. Maybe it's a files that actually sitting right here, right now. Which recipe do you want to use? Drupal, there among others is Drupal 7, Drupal 8, and Drupal 9. What's the name? Where is web root located? So is it straight there? Or maybe it's in the web folder, maybe it's in the doc root folder, and so on and so forth. So once you run lando init and answer all these questions, you'll get something like that. So you'll get .lando.yaml file. And it's pretty simple. So if we go line by line, so name, specifying your specific project, then a recipe, which I decided to use, which is Drupal 9, and then configuration. So config would be which PHP version you want to use. So I decided to go with 7.4. Where's your web root? It's obviously in the web folder. Which composer do you want to use? For those who doesn't know what composer is dependency tool, which is now de facto. So Drupal pulls Symfony dependencies together using Composer. And you can specify which version to use. For example, maybe your Drupal repository is still incompatible with Composer version 2. So yeah, you just say two latest. So and which database to use? There's actually quite a selection of databases: MySQL, Postgres, MariaDB. So once you install it, you have Lando info. But just quickly switching to the repo. And everyone can see it, and it's a bit big enough.
Yes.
Okay, good. Yeah, so after you do Lando init, you can do Lando info. And it will give you all the information about your Lando setup. I already have a couple of services here, but you'll see that once you do Lando start, it will actually provide you with a number of URLs you can run. It actually detects if you have something taken over something took over port 80 and would give you port alternative port. So if my port 80 would be taken by a PHP server that I'm running Symfony on, or some other application like MAMP examp, it will actually create the URL. So your project.lndo.site, and then gives you a port. And then you can see most of the information already told you about. You can see that you can actually, the web server is Apache. You can also use Nginx. So it's quite configurable just out of the box. For those who knows Docker and Docker containers, you can also do something like Docker PX. And you can see there is a number of containers running. So there is one extra container that I added, Node, but out of the box, you would see they're using Bitnami MySQL. Bitnami is quite a big provider of the images to Amazon Web Cloud and other things. They're actually quite big in the Drupal managed images for a lot of cloud hostings. You can see they're running PHP 7.4 with Apache, and there is this traffic container. So 3 containers out of the box, and they reroute in everything. So so that's step number 1. And once you do Lando start, it would spin off the containers. I wouldn't do it just because of the, it might take a bit of time to do that when you spin off your containers. But when it's up there, you can do Lando info, and it will tell you how to access your website. So Lando comes with a bunch of commands. Probably shouldn't close it. So for example, Lando Composer and Lando Drush, because you're inside the containers, you cannot just run Composer or something. You can actually go in there and do Lando Composer, for example, to check the version. So Composer, latest version 2011. Same, you can go Lando Drush version first. I think it's Drush version, not Drush 3. So I found it a bit slow comparing to native setup, but it's, overall, it's pretty good environment because you only have one file you can check. So you can Lando Drush, and once you learn Lando, you can see a lot of other commands. Right. So Lando destroy, Lando power off, Lando list, logs. So for those who know Docker, again, you'll recognize some of the commands. So there is MySQL command there. So you can do Lando and explore the commands. So some of them are directly related to Drupal. So because we use Drupal recipe, it actually would bring the command something like db export and db import actually is a Drupal specific command, because when we say recipe, okay, I need Drupal 9 repository, it says, okay, I know that you can export and import the specific database. Any questions about just the basic setup? So we have our web server, which is by default Apache. Yep.
What is Lando? What is
it's an alternative to web? It's the same sort of thing. It sets up a hosting environment locally for you.
So it's
just like web.
So that's where I started. Is basically we have a junior developer, and she didn't have any dev environment on her machine. So I have a choice of either, go the hard way and teaching her Docker, which she didn't know, maybe do something like MAMP, but we run in XAMPP. But again, it also would take some time to do it, especially configuring database, some paths. Maybe she runs Windows, which I'm not really good at. So I decided to try Lando, because it's basically puts containers together and gives you the development environment.
You just get that config file and then just run Lando build or start and do it for you.
What's next? You develop a site. You want to Hey, to a live server. What do you do? Do you use Lando too, or
You can do that. So I don't have an example of that yet here, but yes, you can actually use a recipe that connects either to your Git or to, if you have a hosting with Pantheon and Platform SH, you can actually beam it directly there. So we'll open. I'll open and then the documentation, and we'll show you how to do it. But at the moment, I'm just showing. And again, you cannot. They don't recommend to use Lando. It actually states on their website they do not recommend to use it on their as a production environment. Just purely
security or performance?
both, because it's actually more of a development environment. Bree says Pantheon integration is slick. So yeah, maybe we'll have another presentation. We'll just show you maybe how to integrate it with Platform SH and Pantheon specifically. But yes, so it actually integrates with, as I said, Git, Pantheon, and Platform SH, and you can actually push it to those things. But at the moment, a few other things I wanted to show is, so the environment is not ready really, because we don't have an NPM, and we know most of the modern setups require NPM and Node.js. So that was the next step, because we do have Sass compilation for our Drupal theme. So I thought, oh, how can I...
Just adding to the Pantheon and Platform SH, I remember hearing that with Acquia killing Dev Desktop, they're going to up their compatibility, like if you're not using Cloud IDE, to be Lando as their preferred local as well.
Yep.
Yeah, we use Lando, but not on Acquia, with Acquia.
Yep. So because, like, theoretically, Acquia is running the Git setup, so you can actually do a Git setup to push it into Acquia, and then run a couple of extra commands to, you know, like update the database and clear the cache. That's what you do.
We use BLT, which is
Yep.
Acquia's build whatever tools,
Yep.
and Lando locally, and then BLT just deploys it, which is Git basically. Yeah, using Git.
So continuing on, we'll talk about Lando Drush, but as I said, what should I do if I want to run npm? So I want to install package. I already have package.js in my environment. Again, my environment or new developer environment is not ready. So how would I make them to run npm? So I went to, again, Lambda documentation, find services. Here. Yeah. Fake. There you go. So, and if you scroll through the services, it gives you some of the different examples. And here's supported services, so you can have Elasticsearch, Mailhog, a lot of things that do require to run as a services. So the next thing I did was to copy one of the examples, which says if you want a node as a service, you just say which container you want to use. If you never used Docker before and don't know where to find those containers, there's plenty of containers. One of the most popular repositories is Docker Hub, unless your company runs specific repository. So Docker Hub contains containers for Drupal, Composer, everything. So, and usually if you type something like services type node, it knows, okay, I need to go to a Docker Hub and pick up the node container with a version 14 behind it. So this is a tag. And it's very similar to how we specify the version of Composer, although it doesn't grab the Composer container.
So is it just like a skin on top of Docker Compose then?
Yes. That's all it is.
That looks very
It's
similar to
very-
Docker Compose.
Very simple compared to Docker Compose.
Mm.
Yeah, it's just humane.
And easy to pass around.
Yeah, it's hideous.
And I also said, so in this build parameter, I also said when you run Lando restart on Lando start, do a npm install. One tricky bit is because I already ran npm install on Mac, and inside the containers it's Linux, it actually ran into clash saying the binary that's already present supposed to be for Mac. It is for Mac OS. So if you run into that problem, just remove your Node modules, not modules folder, and do npm install so it would get the new code and it just create new binaries specifically for Linux.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay.
I created a new site and then put the stuff.
Yep.
Yeah. I
Yep.
was wondering how you came across that.
No. Yep. So
Makes sense.
if you were running the composer before or Node before in your local setup and then switching to Docker, you might find some clashes. But again, deleting the Node modules and installing it going to be a trick. But so doing that and doing Lando restart, as I showed before, so brought another container. So it's brought Node container, but again, how do I route Node? Because if I do Lando SSH, it's dash. So let's see. Oh, I think it's a dash command. So let's say I want to run just standard Linux command like pwd inside Lando. I do that, and it runs fine. It says, okay, your current folder is /app. And then I say, okay, I want to run npm. And it goes and says, fail, it's not found. So especially if I don't know how Composer runs, I have no idea that I actually run specific container. So Lando SSH runs an application container, which is app server 1 here, but I actually want to run DSG node 1 here. So if you know Docker, you know that you can actually execute the npm command by running, and I had it written down. Yep.
This service, if you do -s, you go up,
Uh-huh.
you go back to your previous command.
Yep.
And do -s.
Yep. So Cameron is good at reading the help documentation here. You can see dash service. So actually, let's try that. Actually specify service, which is, how did we call it?
DSG.
Node. So we call it service node. We can do that. So that's run npm. We can also do, as I said, as few people pointed out, Docker exec interactive with terminal. Then actually name of the container from
Just,
here.
Lando npm. Lando npm.
There is no such command.
Sure.
Yes.
Good.
It's
Because a lot
here.
of the Lando things will just run.
I guess if you have a recipe for, not for Drupal 9, but if you have a recipe, Lando recipe for Node, then it will be Lando Node. But because we have Lando Trash, Lando Composer, because of the recipe, so you need to spice it up yourself.
Where did it go? There you go. So that's how you run npm using Docker. But again, you wouldn't expect junior developer knowing how to run Docker or really navigate through the containers. So I thought maybe there is a way to actually do Lando npm and define commands. And surprise, surprise, there is. So in tooling, you can define a bunch of commands, including the new commands. So you would say it's a Lando npm. You say which service, description, which command to run, and run as which user. There is also extra parameters, but this is basically in a nutshell. So I created 2 commands in my npm. So now when I go Lando, there is now Lando npm here. And I also created Lando Sass that compiles Sass automatically for the thing. So now I can pass those 2 commands to a junior developer and say, okay, if you want to run npm, just do Lando npm. Get the same results. Here it goes, the npm command ran. So now if we look at the Lando file itself, so first bit, which is just the default, which recipe we're using, then the service itself, Node. So we actually brought another container. I also managed to get Composer install for an app server, which is default app server. This definition is probably in the Drupal 9 recipe. I do Composer install. I'm also removing the old deprecated dependency, which is used to speed up Composer, but now with Composer 2 is not working. And then our tooling, where we define the npm command, which is just run npm. Does it mean we're offline or? Okay. And Sass command, which is basically goes and run npm run theme build Sass. So that's the way I can actually share number of commands with the developer, and it's all in Lando file. So you can do kind of wrap up a lot of commands in here and pass it on.
Why
So
do you need to run npm within the container?
Because you don't know what sort of environment that person has on there.
So let's say the machine is brand new.
Abstract
There you go.
local user. Like, if you run any container, why not? That's what we're doing.
Yeah.
Or get a brand new computer, get client
Yep.
straight away.
So from what I'm hearing, this is kind of like using function, but web service.
Yeah, so this basically do a shortcut for the command inside the container. So with the containers, if you've never done Docker, you can put, so your web server Apache running in one container, your database running in another container, your maybe search indexer running in the third container. Then you can bring Node and Node.js running in a fourth container and Composer running in the fifth container. So the containers kind of sit in the same network. And now you need to, I guess, control them. So you don't expect, especially for junior developers, you don't expect to know how to restart a Solr search or how to index Solr search. So for example, if you have a website and if you want to index it for a faster search, a lot of people don't know that. So what you do, you create those shortcuts. For example, Lando Solr restart, and that's it. But maybe it's a 5 commands you actually have to do. Same with Drupal. Drupal reinstall, you would actually, it's a number of commands. You need to set the permissions, then you need to write site install or database migrate, then maybe you need to set up local variables, maybe enable some modules for Drupal. So in a lot of cases, the actions are 5, 6 commands, which you either can write a good documentation about, which you spend time with, or you can write things like that, where you would say, do Lando Solr, rebuild, reindex, or Lando Sass. Like here, I don't have to explain to a developer which files to compile, right? So for example, Sass, on some projects, we have only one Sass file, but on another, we have Sass file for CSS file for PDFs, CSS file for print, CSS file for screen, and for a screen maybe we have 5 or 6 files. So instead of saying, okay, you need to go and compile 6 SAS files in different folders and different themes, all you do is just provide them the command like SAS compile complete, for example. So it's more of a wrapper to action. So just simplifying it and making sure that, and again, when you hire in a developer, you don't necessarily expect, especially junior to mid developer, you don't necessarily expect them to know the whole infrastructure, especially if you're running multiple services. But you can provide them with a basic understanding and also a wrapper, not necessarily to overload them with a lot of information, but actually providing them a way to quickly do their job in the beginning and maybe then learning about what's behind it.
Similar to like a makefile, if you ever come across that before. I don't know if you would have, but like C uses it a lot, but we use it a lot for Python.
I have heard of it.
It's basically just a bunch of bash scripts that you can run somehow. Like for linting, we run make lint, and that has 4 to 5 different linters that we run in different configurations, pre-configured in the Git repository. So if you're starting off with our project, you download it, just run make lint. We run on our servers and everything. So it's instead of trying to remember the 5 different things you have to run, you just run that one simple alias, and it just does it for you. If you're curious enough as a developer, you can look into how it gets run. But to start off with, there's no point overloading with running these 5 different commands if you don't need to. And consistency, if you can run it locally, you can run on a test server, you can run on a production server. Possibly not with Lando if it's not performant enough, but with other systems, the abstraction is really useful for that sort of stuff.
Yeah, the other thing as well is like when you have, if you have a Drupal setup with Lando, for example, and with all these commands, for example, SAS compile or whatever, and it sits somewhere in Git and you deployed it, you gave the keys to your client, and that's it, you walked away. And then 6 months later, they come back and said, oh, I have like a couple of requests. Can you change up a bit of styling or add some extra functionality? And you're like, oh, how do I do that? But because it's all in Lando, it's like all in one this wrapper, so that you don't need to remember, oh, how do I set up the database, or how do I do those things, or how do I compile CSS? You're just like, oh yeah, this is all similar, same sets of commands for you to do the job quickly.
And you have the file, the Lando file in the project, so you just run Lando build or Lando start, and it'll build it for you, and then it's up and running again. Whereas,
I just wanted to say that yes, Lando and Docker Compose and Ahoy, and there's a bunch of other ones. They all do functionally the same job, and like Lando is a particularly opinionated version of it, which makes it really good at what it does, but not a thing that you can implement more generically. So for example, I love Lando, I love Pantheon, as I have expressed, but I've actually just advised our company to move away from it because we have a grand total of like 3 Drupal websites. So there's pros and cons to all of it. And so if you mainly work in Drupal, then it can be really efficient. I believe Morgan, I believe I can quote you saying that Lando made it easier to do things the right way than the lazy way. So
sounds like something I would have said.
Things just like Lando pull, and you've got a new copy of the database, and so if you're using it the way it's built to be used, it's really powerful. But if you're trying to do other stuff with it, it sort of ties your hands a little bit and makes it more complicated.
So out of interest, what do you, if you're at that smaller scale, then rather than using the opinionated kind of local dev tool, what do you think is more suited to the kind of more generalist company that has a larger stack?
I believe we're just going back to Docker Compose and probably make files, but
okay, so just taking that layer of abstraction out.
Yeah.
Got it. Makes sense.
It's more about the CI/CD in Pantheon than Lando itself, but yeah.
I mean, like even with Pantheon's got that kind of flavored is it Terminus, that version of Drush that they have? Yeah, so yeah, that makes sense.
Just talking about the Pantheon. So when you say their source is Pantheon, it actually does install extra tooling specific for Pantheon, because Pantheon also runs WordPress. So they mentioned here somewhere they install. So they say closely mimics Pantheon stack and versions and environment, allows you to pull and push. So when you're asking about the deployment, with the Pantheon specifically, you actually can do push. So it syncs with the Git repository and pushes it. And if you use Pantheon before, Pantheon actually does automatic build of the website on the platform. Very similar to what Platform SH does. So it's a bit of knowledge of the specific configuration. But it also provides you with Drush, which you already had, but Terminus we didn't have in this particular setup. So Terminus is a Pantheon-specific. It's kind of it wouldn't be Composer replacement. It's the development tool, really.
It's Drush for Pantheon.
Yeah, kinda. So yeah, so it's a Drush for Pantheon. They haven't, from what I heard, a lot of trouble now to move into Composer setup because of that, but it was their choice. It also allows you to do some extra things like using Xdebug. So if you're debugging your code and walking through, so this particular recipe do that. You can do the same with the Platform SH and I think Amazy as well. So main sponsors, so they kind of sponsor this development. If you're looking for a specific hosting or some, custom hosting, you probably need to add extra commands, maybe your SSH, your files in there, or maybe you have a CI/CD. So what we do in a lot of cases, we push stuff to GitLab, and GitLab already, if we push it specific branch, for example, if we push stuff to dev would trigger a dev release to Acquia, for example, or Platform SH. So it's not just necessarily Lando that will give you the freedom of doing continuous deployment, but it's probably what's set up on the other side as well. So at your repository, at your CI.
If you want to store it on Amazon Web Services, how do you go? What tools would you use?
Well, if you want to, in a container, if you want to install it via Lando in a container, you can just set up as a recipe. Pretty sure that'd be.
But they don't recommend to run Lando on AWS. So this is more of a development environment. So
sorry, were you thinking locally or on a server?
No, I want to install it locally, of course.
Yeah.
But then I have to upload it to the server.
Is it the Drupal installation, or
Sorry?
is it the Drupal installation, or is that?
I'm doing Drupal 7 still. So
Oh, that's fine. It's it's still supported.
yeah.
You can still use however you're uploading it now.
You can still do Drupal 6 on Lando if you want.
Yeah.
Retro.
I've been using Drupal 7, and I was building the whole environment on Amazon Web Services manually. I think up and then nothing.
So you probably need to look at something like continuous deployment. So what it is, it's usually integrated with you probably have a Git repository on GitHub or GitLab. So once you do that, GitLab now comes with GitHub Actions, and GitLab comes with GitLab CI. And this is where, so once you push the code to a specific branch, you would need set of commands. So whatever you're doing manually now, you need to grab those commands and put them in the continuous integration pipeline. They call them pipelines, and this is how you would do it. So Lando is more of a development environment wrapper. Like, it does allow you to push to Git repository or to Pantheon or to other hostings, so Platform SH, and but it's not. I don't think. I think you're looking at something different as well. So this is more for replicating environment on your local machine, and might have in the link. But you also, even with Pantheon and with Platform SH, you still have files that actually responsible which commands you run once you deploy it. So that's a bit different.
I guess if you're trying to run Lando locally on a certain PHP version, you could run your Docker instance in a production system off that exact same PHP Docker container if you're using like Kubernetes or something. So if you're using production for a specific version of a container, you could probably configure Lando to do it locally on the exact same container. So your dev and production environments are virtually identical. I think I've never used Lando, so I'm just going off assumptions here. But I'm sure you should be able to configure it if it's just a basic Docker compose.
Making it more complicated than you need.
Yeah. I think that defeats the purpose of Lando and making it simple. But I'm sure if you wanted to, you could probably make it work.
Your files are still outside of the container as well, so you can just upload them via SFTP or Git or whatever you want to do.
But Lando requires you to use a certain schema to put your database in a certain folder.
No,
not at all.
It's because we're using Drupal 9 recipe, so they have recipes that are not related to Drupal at all. So they have what's the stack? The
Gem stack.
Yeah, like gem stack. So, for example, supported recipes. So mean. So they have mean stack, which is not related. So all the recipes are backdrop, which is a Drupal fork, Drupal 6, 7, 8, 9, Joomla, Lagoon, which is a managed Drupal environment, Laravel, Lamp, Mean. So Mean would have probably, do they say, what do they have? So Node, yep. And config database C below. So for Mean, so choose a Node version, choose a command. So for Drupal, you would choose something between like MariaDB, PostgreSQL, or MySQL. Here you would use, there you go, you can use Mongo, MySQL, MariaDB, Postgres. So they actually added Mongo as well. So Lando is a bit more than just, it started as Drupal, but now they support multiple stacks. Although it's still, I can see it's very prescriptive. So once you start swearing a bit left or right, maybe you're better off using Docker Compose. But for, as I said, for us, we already have local setup. I personally choose LAMP just because of the speed on Mac. It's just fast. Especially if I need to reinstall website, more than 3-4 times a day, in a Docker setup, it would take me. I would double the time. But now working with Lando for a couple of weeks, it actually been pretty good. It's a bit slow, but it's tolerable, and I can quickly debug the issues here and there with a junior developer. So as Bree mentioned, yeah, it's kind of, there are pros and cons. If you have all senior developers in your team, maybe it's not a good choice, because, or you might have some complicated setup and using services that not necessarily supported by Lando, it's fine. But for, standard Drupal website with maybe integration with Elasticsearch.
I used to manage a Docker Compose file for the site, and then when I had to share that with other people and get them up and running, Lando was like 10 times easier. So much simpler for them.
Yeah, once developer becomes IT, IT department, like where they're looking for, we're looking for a mid-range developer who needs to know system administration and front-end development and the back-end development and the project management and something else. It's like, you're actually looking for the whole IT department. So this is this is kind of just simplifies the system administration back-end setup, just encapsulate, like abstracts it from, so that you have actually a bit of breathing room to start, because that's, once the system grows big, it's like, you need to install Solr and you need to install this thing and this thing and this thing. and then you probably installed the wrong version and now something doesn't work. Where in Lando, Docker Compose, or any other systems that sort of package that, you have a universal, the same environment where you develop. And it doesn't matter which machine you're using, if you're on Linux, Windows, or on the Mac, because so underlying is just Docker container, which is a mini VM that runs there. So it's just you have a whole infrastructure in that file. So you have all these little VMs interconnected, all set up properly, so you don't even need to look under the hood.
Ultimately, you're saying the recipes are improved.
That's the idea behind them. Yeah.
It's also like, from what I experienced, it's also the question: what do you want your new developers to learn in the first months? Do you want them to learn about the project and application you're building, or do you want to learn the difference between how to run Red Hat and Ubuntu, and what's the difference between yum install and apt install? Like your infrastructure kind of, if you can, in my experience, if you can abstract infrastructure and let people learn it later, the project would benefit. But if you hire them as infrastructure support as well as developers for the application, and running some sort of a custom setup, then it's a trade-off. So they won't spend they would spend probably more time debugging, latest version of Red Hat and why Solar is not working there. Rather, when you give them containers and they start on the application straight away, and maybe then start digging into what's the actual setup. In a lot of cases, I don't really know, when I'm working with containers, I don't really know which operation system I'm using on Acquia or Platform SH. I know at one point it was Debian. If they switch, I didn't even know, because they try and that's the idea behind managed hosting rather than AWS box. In an AWS box, you need to know which operating system you're running, which web server you're running, which database you're running, which PHP version you're running. Whereas in those setups, you don't really care, because it's like you do Lando update and it will update you to the latest version, and then you can test your application if that's the goal. So I find it's a trade-off between knowing your environment and actually, knowing your application. And what's your priority?